to the Hidden Figures podcast, Behind the Numbers with the Restaurant Scientist. Within this podcast, we take an in-depth look into the economics of the food service and restaurant industry. The show will examine the economic disparities and inequalities impacting Black food service professionals and restaurateurs. We will support and empower Black food service professionals and restaurateurs by providing opportunities for increased visibility, access to capital, and problem-solving expertise.
No, sit down. You're too kind. You're too kind. Good afternoon. How's everyone doing today? My name is Jason Wallace, and I am the Restaurant Scientist. Thank you. Yes. Here we take an in-depth look at the economics of the food service and restaurant industry. And today I'm so proud and honored to have friend, chef, historian, Therese Nelson in the building. Let's give her a round of applause.
Hey, Jason. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. So to my audience out there, just so you know, Therese is the founder of the Black Culinary History. And, you know, she's an expert on all things historical in terms of food, the travelings of enslaved Africans around the world, and how food has impacted our lives in America. And, you know, as you know, my topics always revolve around the state of Blacks in the food service industry. So welcome to the show, Therese.
Once again, Jason, this is my second time here, so I'm definitely excited to be in conversation with you always.
Absolutely. And because you have such a plethora of knowledge and information that there's no legitimate show out there that won't have you on consistently, because there's so many topics. And as you know, and you and I have spoken before, you know, it's so in depth. Each conversation, each question, you know, could be its own show. Mm-hmm. So again, I want to thank you for coming to the show. And, you know, without any further ado, let's just jump right in it. So, sure. Again, the podcast is about taking an in-depth look at the economics of the current food service industry. I kind of like to take the historical approach by speaking to people like you and really understanding where we've come from a food service point of view. As a professional chef myself, I know I'm standing on the shoulders of many legendary chefs, male, female, you know, going back to, you know, the 1500s. And then, you know, before it was the $890 billion industry that it is now, you know, with, you know, in New York State alone, you got over 40,000 restaurants, eating and drinking establishments. We're not talking about schools and colleges and universities and stadiums and all of the other contract feeding and even military establishments. So this is a big business. This is a huge business. And, you know, I feel like as Black food service professionals, you know, we're not at the table enough. We clearly do not have a large enough slice of this, you know, $900 billion pie in terms of the overall economic impact of the food service ecosystem. And quite frankly, I'm damn mad about it, you know. So that's why I created the show. That's why I bring people on like yourself, so that we can address these issues, because we need these types of platforms to talk about, you know, the disparities, the economic disparities between the haves and the have-nots. And so
say that part.
So, you know, I get my feathers are ruffled on a regular basis, but, you know, we have a lot of work to continue to do. We've done a lot of work, you and myself as well, and others as well. But, you know, we can't, you know, we can't stop this thing. So for me, I need you to educate myself as well as my listeners. I know part of what you do as a historian. There's a historical component, and then I'm assuming there's a journalism component of, you know, like some investigative research behind the numbers and the conditions. Sure. Can you tell us what your approach is and how you balance and straddle those two worlds?
Sure. So it was probably about 10 years ago. I was sitting at Dillard in a room with Joe Randall, maybe not quite 10 years, probably more like 6 or 7 at this point. But he was being, you know, in this room thinking about talking about the food in New Orleans in particular, and sort of the Black hand in that particular pot.
And just so you know, she's talking about the legendary chef Joseph Randall. Let's give Chef Randall. He was my mentor.
That's right.
I don't know, everybody's mentor probably. Yes. So.
Anybody who has ever come into contact with Joe Randall gets some wisdom just sprinkled onto them. And
absolutely,
we were in this room listening to so many historians. We were listening to journalists, folks. I mean, just disparate disciplines across the canon of New Orleans foodways. And he was listening to this room, and not a chef was on any of the panels or in the conversations. And he sort of, like he does, like sit in Sentinel, he sort of looked back and said, y'all got to get some degrees. Y'all, in terms of generationally, talking collectively about Black chefs. That was sort of, he was sort of thinking about our generation. He was saying, y'all need to get some degrees. Y'all have to have the language, the context to be more integral to these conversations. And it was an interesting thing to be charged with, because my site had been around for about 5 years at that point. And it was this way in which he was sort of deputizing us collectively to, one, be better stewards of our sort of cultural history, but also to sort of develop a praxis that would make us inherently valuable in this growing space of food and culture, right? Looking at culinary schools like CIA starting to invest in sort of interrogating our foodways. We're looking at museums like MoFad, but also mainstream museums like Museum of African Diaspora in San Francisco, Schomburg Center, et cetera. Lots of spaces, cultural spaces that saw this curve happening, where we were going to have to think more critically about Black foodways. And I think a lot about that moment, because there is no real training to do culinary history work. It's a subset of most historic disciplines that gets overlooked. It gets conflated with anthropology in a lot of ways. And I mean, the label you gave, I don't want to consider myself a historian. I consider myself a curious chef who looks to developed spaces to find answers to critical questions we're not asking. That said, I mean, nice. Think about Vernon Grosvenor. She was a culinary anthropologist. I think about the culinary students we have now, Jessica Harris, Michael Twitty. These are the folks that I'm listening to and looking after. But the work I do, is certainly asking the same kinds of questions historians ask. The writing I do, I think, is the thing that maybe puts the work I do in a journalistic standpoint in terms of digestion. Journalists, I think, have the power of crossing disciplines and using sort of tactics from other disciplines to sort of share questions, answers to questions that they have, the curiosity of journalists. Combined with the praxis of historians, I think makes for really interesting content. So that's kind of where my work sits. So
absolutely. So let's back up a little bit. Chef Randall inspired you. Tell my listeners about your background, what type of education in your work profession.
Sure. Well, I did not take his advice in terms of going to school, because honestly, there aren't I'm excited for young people I meet today who are going to be ready in 5 or 10 years to further their sort of education in the sort of historical, cultural spaces, because right now there aren't degrees that exist. No historian that I know of who does work in the culinary history space has a degree, because there isn't one yet.
Exactly.
But I'm a chef, so my degrees are in hospitality and food service from Johnson & Wales. I've been a chef for about 20 years. My site's been around since 2008. And I would say the way I've sort of filled my toolbox praxis-wise is doing the work of a PhD program on my own. So you want to go and get a PhD in whatever, public history, et cetera. You essentially committing yourself to 4 to 7 years of reading and research to sort of flesh out this original idea that you have, to fortify it with information and to digest it into a tangible dissertation.
Right.
And for me, that's kind of where I'm at. Like I'm working on a book project right now that is essentially the dissertation of the last, 10 years of research. What does it mean to be a Black chef in America? What is the legacy that we have, that we stand on the shoulders of? What are the questions that you would ask of American history through the lens of chefs, through the lens of sort of the original American chef, which in my opinion, are Black and brown bodies. I think some of the things that I know you want to get into, but certainly that consume a lot of the research I do is really about taking the questions we ask about the things that we say about ourselves, and the fact that our hands are sort of built on American cuisine. It's a very lofty thing to say, and we never take that idea further. Sure, our hands were in that pot, but in what context? How? Like, because we sort of leave a lot of answers on the table by sort of deferring to the fact that the ways in which traditional research exists, we don't have access to. We don't have written history, right? We don't have cookbooks that tell us who we are or who we were. We don't have, because our history was taken from us in a lot of ways. The evidence of our place, our space in this sort of history is often in between the lines. I think about Saidiya Hartman a lot. Talks about the afterlife of slavery and the fact that doing work as a historian, looking at Black life, especially during enslavement, is really about looking between the lines. Looking between records to find where we should have been but are left out of conspicuously.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So, and then again, having said that, make the connection for us between American cuisines, plural, and the African diaspora. Like, so talk to me, and the second part of that question would be moving right into the current American menus that we see, and the direct connection between the transatlantic slave trade and American cuisine as we know it, which is extremely regional, broken down by region.
Sure. So I always get sort of frustrated when we sort of talk about the diaspora as though it's not a space that is or a site for Black agency. Like, we look at it and we think about it relative to sort of where we can see ourselves in terms of sort of American context. And we sort of look at the ingredients or look at sort of techniques and don't really think about the fact that we have a whole rich, though, like the history of the world starts in Africa, right? And so we think about Black life always in American context, beginning with slavery, and it's true, but it's also only half of the story, right? This rich life, this life of context and culture and language and food existed before we were stolen and brought here. Also, slavery in the context of America is only half the story, because slavery in the Caribbean is really was a test case for slavery in America. So much of what we miss when we don't really think diasporically intentionally is that we miss evidence right there in the Caribbean that tells us so much about how it evolved itself on the sort of continental United States. That said, I think it's important to sort of think about the fact you brought up an idea earlier that is really important to me. The context of restaurants is really a relatively new idea.
Brand new.
In terms of like launch, like in terms of like a trajectory. Restaurants are new. I mean, America is a baby country relative to the rest of the world, and restaurants themselves are really only an aspect of the last 200 years, if that. The sites for the spaces of food service were really plantation kitchens. They were the derivative businesses from plantation kitchens. So you think about somebody like a Hercules Posey or James Hemings, who were cooking for presidents and dignitaries, and but the plantation kitchens were spaces where communities would come and eat. So it wasn't just the family that you would have been serving, but the community you also serve. So if you were a chef who was, literally from whole cow to presented beef dish, everything from that cow, the tallow, I don't know, everything, milk, all those derivative products, you were responsible for maintaining, create, like, sort of craft and creating candles, all these derivative products. You would have had the technical ability to sort of make, and the cottage business of sort of selling those wares to the rest of the community would have been 100% part of your life, part of your business. And so I think we sort of misrepresent or underestimate the expertise and acumen of enslaved cooks, because they weren't just, it wasn't just sort of this mindless servitude, right? It was folks who had multiple talents, who were responsible for training other cooks. So the plantation kitchens become some of the first cooking schools that we have in this country. I mean, James Hemmings in Monticello, after he gets back from France, is literally the first cooking school in this country. And so there are ways in which we have to ask better questions about what enslaved life would have looked like. Certainly would have been like regional. It would have been different generationally. And I think the site of what a sort of examples that closest resemble the DNA of our current food service industry really only kind of show themselves in the late 1700s. So you're talking about, sort of thinking about like 1765 when Hemmings is coming back from France. This is the first time that we've seen actual cooktops, cook stoves. We go from hearth cooking to actual like ranges. We're talking about just much ingredients, techniques like ice creams and custard making, and all these ideas that didn't exist in this country before then are brought back through the hands and the knowledge of chefs like Hemmings. So I just think that we have to think about it relative to the generation we're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's go back. I know that was a two-part question, but let's just go back and now describe what was a life like in an enslaved chef. I'm going to call them chefs because that's what they were, right? Sure. And if we said, okay, again we talked numbers, but 46,000 plantations, and what does that kitchen look like? I mean, we walk into the kitchen now as a chef. I got an exhaust hood. I got a fire suppression system. I have refrigerations. I got flat burners, char broilers. That was not the case. And they were putting out 12, 13, 14 course elaborate meals, catering, and everything from cold appetizers to hot appetizers to entrees to cheese. And even the beverages and the style of service and the plates, the forks. So
And that was all us.
I don't we need some applause right here, because we don't truly understand how bad these chefs were, both male and female, and most of them were female, right? And the conditions that they worked in. So let's take a little deep dive into that visual. Sure.
Two things. One, I want to say, anybody who's seriously interested in this content, I want you to read Michael Twitty's Cooking Gene. Also, Kelly France Dietz, Bound to the Fire. Both of those books really give really beautiful and thoughtful and thorough examinations of what the life of an enslaved cook would have been like. But I'll say this. I think about, it would have been, say, 1785. We're talking about Virginia, at least a decade plus after Revolution. America is trying to find its own identity. And Jefferson is in France. He takes James with him. He's learning at the seat of Versailles. He's learn he's free there, which also Hemmings becomes like the most patriotic act I've ever experienced. My most patriotic story in American history is James Hemmings coming back to the US when he was really free in France. But they bring back these cooktops. He has been cooking and thinking about and finding technique all this time in France, and he comes back. And so right before James comes back with this hearth, with his sort of cooking range and his newfangled technique is going to be, and you can, if you ever get a chance to go and visit Monticello, please do. Those kitchens was unearthed by the likes of Lenny Sorensen, who's one of our greatest culinary historians. But right in plain sight, right, you see the evidence or the physical manifestation of what the kitchen would look like. You're talking about a space that's, maybe, 500 feet. You're talking about literally a square open hearth, 6 feet by 6 feet, a metal grate and a hook that you be able to hang a cast iron pot in and put a cast iron, say, pan or sort of flat top essentially on, but that's it. You're talking about baking bread, you're talking about roasted meat, you're talking about everything you're doing hot being done on literally an open flame, over coals of fire, but literally over open hearth cooking. You have to gauge those temperatures, those timings through just mother wit and being able to know sounds and sort of timing. Literally from cane C to cane C is, literally chopping wood to build your fire, having it be ready and able to sustain the entire day. When James comes back with the heart, though, so you're thinking about 1785, 86, all of a sudden you're looking at the ability to do fine sauce work in easier, more efficient ways. You're talking about, thinking about, bringing ideas around like frozen desserts, like multi-sensory desserts. You're talking about, the ability of a cooktop now means you can do intricate sugar work. And so I think that, to me, that's you talk about like the kinetic, like historical points of culinary evolution that like it's kind of before James, after James. Because then Monticello becomes this really important epicenter for this new style. And so plantation owners are sending their cooks from all over the country to go to Monticello to import the same cook ranges to sort of live up to and be equal to what's happening down in Virginia. I think the reason I said earlier, the part about really sort of getting hyper specific about what areas we're talking about is that regionality is important, right? Then enslaved people, our plantations are about land. So in the North, you wouldn't have been so much a full plantation as much as it would have been enslaved people doing work that no one else wanted to do. So you would have had enslaved cooks who were operating in a relatively urban context. So you got cooks who are in Philadelphia, who, thinking about, James and Hercules were both in Philadelphia, but, what does it look like to be in, say, South Carolina, where everything from, the animals you grow to the fruit and vegetables that you are producing, you're also responsible for that labor, versus the North, where those meat products coming from the South, from farther west, and you sort of having to sort of fabricate more than produce. So I think it's just regionality and era are super important when we're talking about what that life would look like. Absolutely. But really in all contexts, especially before we really understood that the food and beverage industry was valuable, when white folks didn't want to do this work, when it was only us, we were really responsible for the whole ecosystem. Right. And I think those are the areas, those are the points that I think, to me, reframe a kind of agency to Black cooks, Black food entrepreneurs, because they looked, you again, the whole ecosystem, we existed in the whole process.
Absolutely. And let me just share some numbers with my listeners. So even though COVID has impacted the food service and hospitality industry negatively, you still had in 2021, you still had $799 billion in annual sales with over 90,000 eating and drinking establishments in the country and 14 million employees. Right. So we're not even, as Chef said, we're not the entire ecosystem. We're not talking about all the equipment, all of the ovens and grills and deep fryers that were sold to those restaurants. We're not talking about all of the flour, the sugar, the salt, the potatoes, that, all of the other commodities that, in terms of the distribution of food, plastic, paper, plates, glasses, silverware, just the entire, food service ecosystem. And again, why are we having this discussion? Because are we at this table? Are we really at the table? Are we really benefiting financially, economically from an industry that literally we created, right? We didn't create, we own and operated it, and established the standard.
This is something I'm sitting with too recently, and it's partly because of the book, but really I sit with it because there is this kind of, and I've been trying to work it out over the last 5-6 years via, archives and some other areas. I've just been wanting somebody to finally lead me to the right place, because I think that there's a really important fact, this idea that we don't talk about enough about when does it go from a time where we were the bulk of, the majority of the, when we were the workforce in this industry, when does the shift happen where all of a sudden we're no longer part of this industry, or we sort of a guest, we sort of, not quintessentially American chefs. Right. It's, and I posit that it's probably during the civil rights era. I think about Adrian Miller wrote a really good book, The President's Kitchen Cabinet. And it sort of chronicles, again, this goes back to something I said earlier about the work of historians being disparate detective work. The reason we know so much about the numbers of enslavement, the reason we can sort of posit something about what enslaved life would have looked like is not because anybody took particular care or record of what that experience was. Certainly abolitionists would have taken first-hand accounts, but we really don't have a lot of examples of first-hand, sort of intentional record of what enslaved life would look like. What we do have, and the reason we know a lot about, say, Monticello, is because Jefferson wrote. And so we sort of read in his papers, his diaries, et cetera, and can find the bits and pieces to tell us something that we can draw like larger inference about. All of that said, the Kitchen Cabinet book is really interesting because through the lens of the White House, where records are meticulous, we can sort of distill what sort of colonial life would have looked like the rest of the country. If this is the sort of example that the rest of the country is drawn from, we can kind of infer a lot. It's not until the 1960s when John F. Kennedy becomes president that the full staff, the responsibility of, the cooking in the White House is all African American. Definitely segregated, definitely, complicated, definitely problematic. But we see that like the food service, the sort of the service of everybody from the first family to foreign dignitaries is done by Black bodies. When Kennedy becomes president, all of a sudden there's this European aesthetic that becomes much more palatable and valuable. The idea of fine cuisine in this way that sort of puts the United States in this position to lead in some way globally, start leading some way globally in terms of aesthetic becomes attractive. And so you start to import chefs, right? You, like intentionally, J1 visas start around the same era.
Absolutely.
You think about somebody like a Jacques Pepin. I love Jacques Pepin so much because he's one of the only chefs from this generation who is adamant about talking about how when he came to his country, that it was Black chefs, Black cooks, who were primary to teaching him about American cuisine, and sort of seeing who was doing the real labor and who was the bulk of the workforce that he was in sort of confronted with. And we know that there's a sort of concerted effort to sort of change the demographic of that workforce. But Jack Pan comes here in sort of the late 50s, early 60s. And so there's something to be said for this sort of era being a really particular sort of turning point in the way what we judge as a sort of American food service. That said, I just think that there's something inherently problematic about misremembering history in that way.
Absolutely.
That's literally half a generation ago. So there are people still alive who remember the time.
Yeah.
And so how are we forgetting that? How are we, your point about the pieces of the pie is tricky because in what context, who does it benefit to change the demographic of who, even is it 1977 is, sorry.
When it became a profession and by the Labor Department.
That part.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
part. 77.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm doing work with the CIA right now.
Yeah.
I want to get into the archives because Ferdinand Metz got some things to answer for, but I'm interested in what that effort looks like. Right. Yeah. There's a very specific shift in using the language of chef, because Jacques Pepin came in, he was a domestic worker in terms of the government's eyes.
Absolutely.
Like, what does it mean to change and sort of professionalize an industry that had always been?
Absolutely. And I can speak to that a little bit because in the 60s, I mean, you basically had Howard Johnson, you had family style restaurants and you had chains. You had McDonald's, White Castle, Howard Johnson's, right? Those were families. There was no sophistication. There was no appetizer, entrees, dessert, no a la carte, no finesse needed in terms of cooking. The hotels were different, right? So the hotels is where you would find in the 60s a Chef Joe Randall, you know what I mean? And, not having the title, not having to pay to support that title, but doing all of the work, right? Now, and then those that were chefs were raising kids that didn't want their kids to be chefs or cooks. Right. So that's your mid 60s. And at that point, the restaurant industry was really just fast food and family style restaurants for the most part. Then you get into the 70s, and then that's when, you have the Galloping Gourmet, and you have Julia Childs and some of the early pioneers of of television, quote unquote, chefs and cooking.
And that's when Chef Joe says it a lot. He talks about how he was a generation where, all of his people, none of his parents didn't want him to go into this industry. Nobody would. And so, yes, I think that there's something to be said for very real. Once you have options, if this was, literally hospitality jobs were passed down generationally. In these families. You're talking about caterers who, upward mobility in the food service industry was a site for, we see examples of millionaires being made in catering, millionaires being made in sort of these derivative businesses around food service.
Right.
And that's beautiful, but the children of generationally of these families, of these folks who have always been in food service, finally getting the ability to send kids to medical school, or to law teachers, colleges, whatever. Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, that's part of why there's a sort of shift. Right. But I guess there's something that feels a little sad to me about that. Yeah. That there's this forfeit of this long legacy lineage in American hospitality, and at the exact moment when it starts to become this viable, respected, profitable industry. You see this combination of exodus and reframing. Absolutely.
And exclusion. And the exclusion of, because and there were a lot of illegal tactics going on. I remember coming out of culinary school. For those that don't know, I'm a chef by trade, Culinary Institute of America graduate, 3 times culinary degree, bachelor's and master's, and you could go do a stage, at a 4-star or 3-star restaurant here in Manhattan, and work for 2 weeks just to see if they were going to give you the job, and then at the end of for free. 10 hours a day, you know what I mean, to try to prove your worthiness. And then that's when I kind of got discouraged. And, you know, even once I graduated the CIA, I went to Harlem and introduced myself to Miss Sylvia Woods. Because after I learned French cuisine and Italian cuisine and German cuisine and charcuterie and all those things, I started looking for the black chefs, went to the library, and they weren't there. They were not there. So for me, this journey started in 1987 professionally. And it's still something that is near and dear to my heart. But as you said, you know, and as I know why the show is, you know, I created the show is because I want to peel back the layers of that economic, you know, that economic power. And, you know, go to Las Vegas. Do you see any black-owned restaurants? Nah, I ate at Jean Georges. My steak was $112. Came with a nice piece of foie gras on it. You know what I mean? But yeah, I don't see us in Vegas. I don't see us in Aspen, Colorado. I don't see us in Miami. I don't see us in mainstream New York City, Chicago, Atlanta. So, you know, that loss of history and lineage is a financial problem that, you know, why people like you are so valuable to me, because even, you know, every time I speak to you, I learn something new as well. So let's kind of connect it to, we got about 10 more minutes. Sure. Let's now describe current American cuisine and trends versus fads, and then the connection between, you know, our history and our current generation of chefs who I see on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram, and they're doing some phenomenal things. You know, can you speak to that a little bit?
So one of the reasons why I started my site, more than just asking better questions, was really about sort of my own feelings of negligence with reference to cultural cuisine.
Let's get a hand clap. Let me get some applause on that right there. Negligent. That's right. That's how I felt. That's how everyone should feel, because if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And if you're silent, it's not going to help us. Go ahead, Chef.
Generally speaking, I'm the kind of person, I mean, I don't think that especially when it comes to the work of, I mean, we know we suit up as chefs for really, I mean, just lots of reasons you choose to do this work. But at the end of the day, you're interested in having something interesting, valuable to say through your technique, and you want to present it to someone to consume, right? There's a simple but powerful exchange. And I think my questions to myself back then were, what do I have to say? And also, what am I being filled up with in terms of information about who and what I am, right? Those questions aren't answered easily, but I think that they are just as important and valuable as like your technical acumen. And so I think something about who we say we are is an important question to ask, and what information you're using to define that is important. You use the word fad and trend, which I think is interesting, because I sort of cringe when I hear, especially Black folks, but folks talk about this moment, or talk about the attention or the viability of Black foodways as a trend. I'm concerned that that's our thinking, because we're always Black, right? I think you show up, you are informed by a palate that has cultural references, that's sort of flavored by experiences, and, you know, sort of the food you grew up on, the food you were inspired by. And I'm not interested in prescribing to anybody, especially anybody Black, what they should cook, but we have right here in our own culture a diaspora of delicious ingredients, delicious techniques that can inform and make your food better. There's something about the way Black folks season food. There's something about the way in which we approach food culturally that is beautiful, delicious, and valuable. Right. That said, I think we have to be as rigorous about our culture and the way we express it to the general public as we are about everything else. I watch chefs, Black chefs in particular. I'm really here for everybody Black, so I'll just stop using the caveat. I'm interested in being in a community with Black people and Black chefs. And I am so interested when I watch Black chefs or watch my colleagues spend thousands of dollars on modernist cuisine and love to go to, the French Laundry and be inspired by, the most beautiful and most rarefied air in our industry, but aren't spending the same kind of investment in our own culture. What does it look like? I mean, again, I'm not saying everybody needs to go to, sort of, was it the year return was recently to Ghana, like, the Guyanese people were sort of looking sideways, and all of a sudden Black people realized that they were also from this place. I don't have an opinion about what your exploration should look like, but I'm saying that there's a responsibility I think we have to be as rigorous about our cultural presentation as we are about every other aspect of our professional lives. I think it's inspiring when you taste the food of somebody who's so serious about diaspora. Look at the James Beard Awards. There's this young brother, Serene Love, out of New Orleans, who's he's represented Senegal in New Orleans and making connections that have been, we know that you can't taste New Orleans without tasting Senegal. You can't taste Charleston without tasting Ghana, right? Like, we know that there are like very direct links from the U.S. To the continent, to the Caribbean. We can taste the similarity. It's our responsibility to be able to make those connections from a culinary standpoint. I think that we see young people, especially, but chefs who are so serious about that work, the Serenes, the Ashley Shanties, the Omar Tates, the BJ Dennises, that you are inspired to think more critically about what culture could look like in every context, right? From your, JJ's at rice bowls at field trip to, to Carnola, to Itan, to, in Nigeria. Like this, there are points of inspiration globally of Black chefs who are finally seeing resonance and power and value in our own culture and starting there, using that as the epicenter of your culinary practice. I'm not saying that's the way it has to be. I'm saying that's as delicious, as important, as viable, and as powerful as it's starting from anybody else's culture.
Absolutely.
And I think that we're just a really kinetic point now where we also can back that up with content, right? We can back that up with cookbooks and back it up with media content and writing and just, restaurants and chefs who are showing us what that looks like on a plate.
Absolutely. Wow, powerful knowledge and information. Let me get some applause from the studio. Chef Therese Nelson, we have 2 minutes. Any last departing words you want to share with the audience? How do people contact you? Where can they buy your book? How can they get your services? How can they do business with you?
Sure. Book is forthcoming. I'm shopping it right now.
Okay.
But you please, anybody, I'm available. My website, blackculinaryhistory.com. Email me, reach out there anytime. Got some exciting things going on. Recent CIA grad, Carolyn Hosanna, is now writing for my blog. So she's putting out really interesting content weekly. I'm doing 2 projects now. One is sort of over, but it's sort of come to fruition. I was an advisor for the Museum of Food and Drinks Africa/American exhibit that's on display till Juneteenth at the Africa Center right here in Harlem. So if you are in the New York City area and want a wonderful afternoon of Black food and food history, go up to Africa Center, get your experience, get your shoebox lunch and experience.
What's the address? Can you drop that address?
I don't think I know the address of the Africa Center, but it's right Central Park South, the East Side Rotunda, the roundabout at the top of Central Park. So you
110th Street.
Yep, 110th Street. Top of Museum Mile.
Yeah, got it.
Right, it's right there. But that project has been a 5-year labor of love led by Jessica Harris. so many advisors, but ideated and conceived by a panel of Black food historians, writers, chefs, etc. is there and beautiful, and just want people to experience it. And I'm also working with the CIA on their Worlds of Flavor conference. Keep your eyes open and ready, because this year we focus on the food of African diaspora. It's going to be a very Black town in Napa, and it's going to be wonderful. So those are the two things I'm working on most right now. And yeah, just check out the website, keep current. It's lots of good things there.
Put that website out there again one last time.
Sure, blackculinaryhistory.com.
blackculinaryhistory.com. You heard it. Check her out. She's phenomenal. We want to thank her for coming to the show. Studio audience, we want to thank you with some applause. So that concludes another episode of Behind the Numb, the Figures with the Restaurant Scientists. This would not be possible without our sponsor, Eat Okra. Can I get some applause for Eat Okra? We need everybody to go to the Eat Okra app, download the app, regardless of what type of phone you have, Android or iPhone. You can also visit Instagram, Eat Okra, and eatokra.com. So without any further ado, I want to thank you all again for coming. And until we meet again, my name is Jason Wallace. I'm the Restaurant Scientist. Power to the people!
You are watching a master at work.